Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with my dwarf unit tier list for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires campaigns. The dwarves do have infantry, range units, flying range units specifically, and that does mean they have a good amount of versatility. They don't have cavalry, which, yes, can be a problem, but one of the things to be said about cavalry is you can rely on allied recruitment to get cavalry. In fact, one of the great things about allied recruitment is that it can help you with certain spots in your roster, but you don't really want to rely on it for infantry. And that's a great thing that dwarves do have good infantry. So starting with regular dwarf warriors, definitely an A tier unit, very survivable, very easy to recruit, very effective at their job of holding a line. In fact, get the shield wall ability for them. Usually, research-wise, you kind of want to focus on the benefits for your empire, but still, you do have the ability of really improving these guys, and very few units will be able to stand up to them, or break through them, rather, in a campaign early on. And even later on, they're still quite effective in terms of both auto-resolve and genuine combat ability. Then we have dwarf warriors with great weapons. So with great weapons, I'm going to say that dwarf warriors with great weapons are a D tier unit. When you're looking to build a dwarven army, yes, you can go full-on melee, but it's just far more effective to go with ranged or flying units or artillery or combination, really, than worrying about melee units. The only situation in which I'd use them is if you really need that armor piercing, and even then one can firmly argue that what you lose from a shield perspective is not really worth getting these guys just from that survivability perspective. A shield does matter quite a bit, especially given the enemies you're going to be dealing with, as well as the auto-resolve situation. Like, shielded units just tend to do better in auto-resolve from what I've noticed, unless you have a full melee stack. Then we have Dwarven Miners. So Dwarven Miners are an F tier unit. I just don't see really a value proposition in recruiting them unless you literally have nothing else to recruit. But given the kind of variety that dwarves have in their roster, available very quickly in their campaigns, as well as the level that their settlements start at, then I just don't see a value proposition in getting miners, unless, again, you just want to fill up an army. But it's very easy to get a tier 1 barracks and just get dwarf warriors, really. So yeah, miners just are not as good as many other units that are even available at same tier. Then we have miners with blasting charges. I'm going to say that these guys are a C tier unit. The value proposition is early on in the campaign when you just want that AoE damage that their blasting charges do. Keep in mind, you're going to potentially deal with enemies that are going to close that gap very quickly, so you may not get the most use out of them. Still, it is a unit that you may recruit very quickly in your campaign, but they don't have longevity. So, from my view, it's that kind of situation. Do you want to recruit a unit that you know you're going to want to replace later on, or do you want to recruit units that you may use throughout the course of your campaign? Because there are units available quickly in a dwarf campaign that are pretty useful. Then we have Quarrelers. So Quarrelers, both variants are A tier unit, A tier, because they're just really solid as even a hybrid unit. They're not too terrible in melee, though of course they're not going to do as well in melee as dwarf warriors. But the difference between Quarrelers and Quarrelers with great weapons is that the regular Quarrelers have a shield, so if you're dealing with more ranged opponents, you may want to pick up that shielded version. If you're dealing with a lot of enemy infantry or a lot of Skaven, you might want the great weapon variant. With ranged units, a shield is not as important from an auto-resolve perspective. Obviously, it is important from a battle perspective, but I would say both versions are fairly useful. That solid, steady damage of crossbows cannot be ignored. Then we have longbeards. So we have regular longbeards and longbeards with great weapons. So, great weapon variant, I'm going to put it in C tier. Again, just those kind of issues with auto-resolve, though obviously a better unit than Dwarf Warriors. With respect to regular Longbeards, they're an upgrade to Dwarf Warriors, yes. But the question is it worth the economic cost to really upgrade Dwarf Warriors? Because by the time you can get Longbeards, realistically, you're probably going to have a lot of range capability and the ability of decimating a foe from a long distance. So, and also different priorities in terms of recruitment. So, kind of feels a bit, just a bit, keep in mind, redundant. I just don't think that they're an A-tier unit from a practical perspective in a campaign. Then we have Thunderers. So, Thunderers, this is a bit of a discussion with regards to gunpowder units. They do have fairly decent durability. They're decent in melee again, but you do have some issues with regards to gunpowder units. And the thing is, when you're looking at the dwarf army roster, if you want a lot of gunpowder range damage, you do have grudge rakers as well. But I think I'm going to put both Thunderers and grudge rakers in B tier. Not horrible. Far from it. Very useful unit that you do want to recruit. Just because something is in B tier doesn't mean you don't want to recruit, but just not as universally useful as Dwarf Warriors and Quarrelers are in a campaign. Bull Throwers, yeah, the joke of Bull Throwers, F tier unit. In multiplayer, in artillery deals, they can be useful, but a lot of the time in a campaign, you're not necessarily going to struggle with that as Dwarves. You're going to want units to damage enemy units, enemy foes in a battle. You're going to want units to do well against walls. And just grudge throwers are the more effective unit in a campaign. But yeah, I'm just going to put them B tier with grudge throwers. Again, just because a unit is in B doesn't mean it's not useful. It is one of the earliest artillery units you can get, and it is definitely worth getting during the course of a campaign, early on. But later on, you're just not going to use them because you will get cannons, and usually I would say cannons are just better, especially if you're playing freaking Malachi. Then we have regular cannons. So regular cannons, great ranged unit for sieges, especially. Not so great necessarily on a battlefield, but you do want them cannons. What can I say? Like, this is the kind of unit that you want to get in every Dwarven campaign. There's no situation in which not getting cannons is beneficial to your campaign because, again, siege situation. Even if you are massing a lot of gyros, like, the only situation in which I wouldn't get cannons is if you're just going full on air. Though that's its own discussion whether or not you want a lot of pure air armies. Then we have organ guns, also an A-tier unit. From my view, the damage dealing capability in a field battle, like, you want to use these units together. Organ guns and cannons, I usually get like 2 of them, 2 of each. Or if I'm lacking organ guns, I get 3 cannons, then, give them to another army, get organ guns. 4 artillery units is generally the way I go about things in a campaign. And yeah, organ guns, just really solid unit to pick up in a campaign. Though the tier requirement can be definitely annoying, but with dwarves, you have this kind of situation where you can get a ridiculous amount of growth, especially as you're progressing through the campaign, because you do get those research benefits that really help you out. It's not as ridiculous as High Elves can be or Carl, but all the same, it's still pretty powerful. Flame Cannons, D tier, not a horrible unit, but when we're looking at artillery, Or, you know, if we want flamethrowers, we got flamethrowers. We got flying flamethrowers, even. Flame cannons, I think they're very, very... a very niche unit that usually you don't really care about all that much from a campaign perspective. Rangers, yeah, getting Rangers, decent enough range unit, but Corralers are right there, and they're just flat out better in most situations that you're going to encounter. And besides, if you want Rangers, you should get Bugman's Rangers. Then we have Rangers that are basically melee variant, like, yeah, kind of a questionable situation with regards to these guys. Very situational. Like, I would not usually bother with regular Rangers. In fact, I think regular Rangers are an F-tier unit. Not because they're terrible, but because you literally have no reason to recruit them. You have better ranged unit. You have better Rangers as well. Then we have Bugman's Rangers. If you want to use any kind of Ranger unit in a campaign, this is the one you want to go for. They're just more effective in battle. And, you know, if you want that specific playstyle of Rangers, you know, which can be a bit sneaky, then, yeah, Bugman's Rangers really are the way to go. They're just flat out the better unit to use. Then we have Gyrocopters and Brimstone Guns. Both of them S-tier units, without a doubt. The sheer battlefield flexibility is ridiculous. And of course, you know, when you talk about grudge units, of course, Trollhammer torpedoes are one of the most ridiculous units in the game. But we're talking about the generic roster. I might do a Regiment's Renown video and grudge unit video. But yeah, Gyrocopters... One thing worth keeping in mind, like regular Gyrocopters, they're fairly short ranged, unless you increase that. But the benefit is they drop bombs, they have battlefield flexibility. They used to be even more ridiculous, but CA nerfed them a bit. Brimstone Guns are flamethrower Gyrocopters, so regular Gyrocopters are useful in most situations. Flamethrower ones are against clumps of enemy units. If you want to eliminate, bear in mind, you know, if you're dealing with monsters, it might take them a while to kill stuff. But there's a reason why the Gyro army has become so popular since Thrones of the Cape. One thing I would say about Gyros is that you really want to put like 3 engineers in an army, 2 free engineers in an army to really increase their combat effectiveness, and that's when they really become ridiculous. Then we have Gyro Bombers. So this is the unit a lot of people, I think, don't necessarily talk about as much as they should. But Gyro Bombers are pretty good. Like, against single entities, in terms of killing lords or entities on the battlefield, again, with those engineers, they're quite effective from that perspective, and they have a huge number of bombs. So you know, if you have a couple of units of these guys, even if you haven't gone with Gyrocopters, I would definitely say that a couple of Gyro Bombers in an army is going to be very, very damn effective at dealing with huge swath of enemies. Like in fact, late game, the one unit, the one army that is really effective against pretty much anything is a stack of Gyro Bombers. Far more so than Gyrocopters, from my view. Then we have Hammers. So Hammers, pretty good two-handed infantry if you want to use it, but situational. Most of the time, I think the only lord you really want to use hammers with is Forgrim. There's just that issue with auto-resolve with two-handed units that makes them annoying. And on top of that, they're obviously not going to stand up to, say, Chosen of Nurgle or Chosen of Khorne in a lot of ways, though they can be decently effective against demons. Just bear that in mind. But still, I think that most of the time with hammers, it's just a situation the question is, like, which situation do you want to use them in? And there's not necessarily as many as there should be. I mean, again, you could make an entire melee dwarf army if you really, really want to, but just going ranged is typically more effective. Then we have Armbreakers. So, Ironbreakers, ridiculously good unit. In fact, I'm going to put them in A tier. Higher tier requirement, definitely, but whereas Longbeards, you can ask yourself, is it worth replacing your Dwarf Warriors with Longbeards, given the economic cost and compared to combat capability gain? But Ironbreakers just freaking ridiculous. They're basically the combination of a better Dwarf Warrior unit, much better Dwarf Warrior unit with those blasting charges. So your ultimate infantry unit as the Dwarves is just very, very effective. Then we have Iron Drakes, S tier unit, ground-based flamethrowers. Sometimes you may struggle because of line of sight or the enemy closing the gap, but these guys are ridiculous on multiple levels. The amount of damage they can do in a battle when an enemy is close to engaging them in melee is quite ridiculous. They can delete entire units, or very close to deleting entire units, especially if you buff them up. But on top of that, they do exceptionally well in auto-resolve. Then we have Trollhammer Torpedoes. I think Trollhammer Torpedoes are pretty effective. It's just that tier requirement that makes them a bit less useful. And most of the time, I just find regular Iron Drakes to be the better unit to recruit, because you're dealing with Greenskins, you're dealing with Skaven, you're dealing with Vampires, you're dealing with a lot of freaking shit. I think Iron Drakes with Trollhammer Torpedoes are more useful if you're dealing with equal numbers, which, given Dwarven campaign dynamics, is not necessarily going to be a thing a lot of the time. And then, again, tier requirements. Then we have regular Slayers. I think I'm going to put regular Slayers in F tier. I just don't really see a reason to recruit regular Slayers in a campaign. Just because most of the time when you're dealing with regular Slayers, their combat effectiveness is not worth it. Yes, they're unbreakable. They can do a good amount of damage before they die and all that. They're faster than most infantry units, but even as Ungrim, you kind of just don't care too much about regular Slayers. And even when you do care about them, you're just going to replace them later on if you even recruit them. Then we have Slayer Pirates. Most of the time, situational unit. You only really recruit these guys because you want to get Garagrim as a legendary hero. Outside of that, you do have... they're better than regular Slayers because they have that ranged melee hybrid role. And they're fairly quickly available in a campaign, but yeah, it's mostly just fluff if you want to go with the Slayer army, to be honest. And I think there's a strong argument to be made against that. Then we have Giant Slayers, B tier unit. The reason I'm going to put Giant Slayers in B tier is because of their anti-large role, which, yeah, why do Dwarves not have spears for an anti-large benefit? Why do Dwarves not have an elite infantry unit except Giant Slayers, but an elite heavily armored unit to, do a spear wall, or pikes, or anything like that? Yeah, just be aware. Well, maybe pikes in the underground wouldn't make sense, but that is one of the weaknesses, and that's where Giant Slayers fit in. How often do you want to recruit them? How often will you recruit them? Well, that's the kicker, and that's a question mark. Depends on what you're dealing with, and what the rest of your empire looks like. I'd say late game, if you're dealing with foes with a lot of monsters and anti-large, sure. Then we have our crazy whirlwind dwarves. So for these guys, I'm just going to put them in C tier. That whirlwind and their damage capability. First off, they're annoying to recruit in a campaign, and they're still Slayers, so durability is a big question. And they only really work a lot well if they're engaged in prolonged melee, where they do that good amount of damage. So yeah, I just usually don't really care too much about them even the initial unit that Malachi has is just, yeah, you know, I'm playing Malachi. I think I'm going to use all that wonderful range power and air power that he has available. Then we have our axe throwers, you know, our axe thrower artillery. So I'm going to put these guys in D tier. And the reason is ammunition is limited. You do have a Slayer unit manning it, but the amount of damage can be high on a single target, but you run out of ammo very quickly. Whereas regular Dwarven artillery, they can keep shooting throughout the course of a battle. I think most of the time in a campaign, sustainability does matter. It's kind of like trying to find the middle ground. Some units are very good at dealing damage over time, but due to the length of battles, as well as how you do fight campaign battles, especially on higher difficulties where you might find multiple armies at the same time, especially given AI behavior, then most of the time I just don't think getting your axe thrower artillery is worth it. Then we have the Thunderbarge. So let's discuss this one, because this is where I get a lot of flack. I think there's two factors to keep in mind with Thunderbarges. One, it's overkill against the vast majority of foes. Two, gyro bombers are generally better because they have better speed and are easier to recruit, and they're cheaper to get. And usually throwing a lot of bombs with those gyro bombers is, as well as their single target damage, like that speed does matter, ease of recruitment. So while from a combat perspective, one can definitely argue Thunderbarges are, you know, an S tier unit, I think between the cost as well as the fact you really don't need them pretty much any campaign. Like, I've played a lot of Dwarven campaigns since Thrones of Decay has come out. I've only really bothered recruiting the Thunderbarges that Malachi gets for free in his campaign, and that's it. And there's a reason behind that, because you can get the Doomstack of Thunderbarges, but equally well, you can get a bunch of, you can get 2, maybe even 3 armies that are much cheaper, and equalizing the numbers, especially if you're, you know, dealing with hordes of enemies or greenskin was, is kind of more important. I mean, in campaign flexibility, moving around the campaign, dealing with more fronts, that's kind of the argument I have against a lot of tier 5 units. And if the Thunderbarge was unique in terms of its flying range capability, then yeah, I would rank it higher. But you do have gyro bombers, and usually I would say they're just a much more useful unit to recruit. That's my perspective. And that's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Let me know what you guys think. I'll see you next time.